Well, talofa lava, everyone. Welcome to our session. I hope I'm coming through okay. We've had a few technical difficulties this morning, and so we're trying our best to fix that. But thank you very much to our wonderful team that are working tirelessly behind the backgrounds, Wuta, Andy, and our translators we have today, Matthew and Arona. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to our session today that we're going to be talking about conservation and how we define this. We've got some really great panelists lined up that are going to give their perspectives, not only from themselves, but the people they represent. But before we pass it on to them, I'll just give a quick introduction on who I am and where I come from. So my name is Chanel, or in Samoan, it's Sangele van Dijken. And my mother is Samoan and my dad is Dutch. And I spent a good half of my life in Samoa and really see growing up within my Samoan family and our traditions and how we relate to the land. We hail from the village of Salelua, which is on the south coast in the district of Falealili in Samoa. And I give you this just so that you can see where I find myself and where my identity lies. Because you see, the gift of identity is from our ancestors, which must be always acknowledged and perpetuated. And this is what our cultures have always had in mind, and this the link to our identity and our ancestors, which is linked through our traditions and culture of today. And our traditions and our culture of today is how we converse and talk with our ancestors of our past in our common language. Hence why it's so important, the perpetuation of these practices and these values, this knowledge, as it relates to our living environment and how we connect with that. So as we've moved in more into the modern age, we've come to see how we actually define conservation, because conservation is such a broad term that many different organizations, people, communities have different definitions of how they see conservation and how they relate to it. So this session is just going to explore some of those narratives, explore what the definition of conservation is to some of our people, get some really good feedback and some dialogue along the panelists, as well as invite those that are listening to type in questions that we can also discuss. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, who hails from the Cook Islands. His name is Puna Rakanui. He is the Secretary of the House of Ariki, and he's going to tell us some stories from the Cook Islands, the traditional leadership of the Marae Moana Park, and their perspectives on traditional knowledge and its integration into mainstreaming amongst our policies. I'm actually connecting with him over Facebook because he's in Achu. So let's hope this goes well. Wish us luck. Here we go. And it's over to you.
Over to me. Thank you, Chanel. Kia ora from the beautiful island of Achu. I'm actually not in Rarotonga. As some of you may well know, the Cook Islands is spread over 2 million square kilometers of water, EEZ, and it's broken up into two groups of islands, one lot in the south and one lot in the north. I'm actually in the southern group and about 45 minutes from Rarotonga. I'm hoping that we will be able to cover the time frame that's required for this session before everything falls to bits again. Look, I can't cover everything within the time frame that's allocated. I'll do my very best. I come from this island. I was born over here, raised, bred over here. I went to school over here. Before I went to Rarotonga, joined the Teachers College, and from there I went to varsity. And when I came back to Rarotonga, I graduated and joined the National College before joining Parliament for 27 years. And now I'm with the House of Ariki for the last approximately 10 years. Our tradition and customary practices is
Chanel, we seem to have lost Puna's audio there. I think if you unmute Chanel, maybe that will help.
Can you hear me?
Can you
There
hear
we
us now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, sorry, keep on going here. We lost audio for a bit.
All right, just stop me when you need to. Now, prior to the last 10 years, the focus of the Cook Islands policy, national and island-wise, has always been towards accepting, being very receptive to Westernization. Now, then we moved the House of Veriki away from Parliament, and we delved as much as we could into reviving our traditions and customs. And one of those being our Marae Moana, our ocean. I believe that many of you may have heard about Keveniro. Keveniro came to the House of Veriki to champion the concept of conserving our Moanonio Kiva. We have a huge ocean out here, but we have a small, 15 small islands scattered over the 2 million square kilometers. Now, he tried to bring in the Aromamana, the sub-chiefs. He tried to bring in agencies to help him champion the preservation of our Moanonio Kiva. At the end of the day, he realized that he needed to approach the House of Riki, the paramount Riki's leaders, traditional leaders of our people. It took a while before the House of Riki accepted him. The ideas that he brought in kind of was so strange because he wanted us to recreate the concept of Rawi, meaning conservation, preservation in our traditional sense, where we impose certain restrictions on limited areas around each island for a certain period. And when the Almighty has rejuvenated the resources in such areas, then we reopen it and harvest it to support our communities. Now, he wanted to transfer that kind of idea onto our Marae Moana. It was difficult. He wanted us to see whether our people would come up with ideas to protect, to safeguard the resources of our Moanonio Kiva. So it came to the point where the House of Veriki, together with a few of the Aromamana and our champion, Keveniro, had to visit every single island. It was a very arduous work. At the end of the day, the people came back and said, we wanted 100 nautical miles around each island to protect the sanctity, the tapu of each island. They transferred the concept of the Rawi onto the Marae Moana. It took us 7 years for consultation, for discussion with our people. We wanted our people to buy into the idea of protecting. And we also wanted to understand how each one of these distinct 15 islands see the idea of conservation at this time. We couldn't go back to the past. When they came back, we realized that a lot of the values in the Southern Group with regard to the conservation of our ocean, not only of our ocean, but also of the resources of our islands, has actually been, excuse me for the word, persecuted. Not only by our own people, but by the activities from outside of our islands. There was so much pollution. There was so much interest from the tourism, for example. There was a lot of focus on tourism. There was little consideration for the original, the traditional customary values, where we impose value to support the lives of the communities, the lives of our people. Now, how do we see conservation today? In 2017, we legislated our Marae Moana. Our total Marae Moana, our total EEZ is now Arawi. What does that mean? It means that we preserve and conserve the resources in these waters to the point where those resources can be utilized at a certain time, to a certain limit, to a certain extent, so that it is sustainable. It is sustainable for the future. We know that from a Western perspective, when you impose conservation, it's supposed to be there for forever. That's not our concept. That's not our idea of conservation. Our idea of conservation is that these are resources to sustain lives. And because of the limitations of each island, of the limited resources on each island, if we are to go back to our traditional ways of imposing customary conservation, then we need to open up these rawi at certain time when the resources are to the point that they can be harvested. Then we close it up again. Look, if I go beyond my time, let me know.
Yeah, Puna.
Chanel, can you hear me?
Yeah, Puna, if you can hear me, I think that we are coming to time. If you just want to wrap up, and we'll give it to the other speakers, and then we'll come back to you, because I'm sure there's going to be some really great questions.
Thank you. I know there are huge differences between the way we see conservation. Conservation to us is invaluable, but we must understand conservation in the terms of the indigenous people. I believe that is the only way to move forward. If we are to ban our people from accessing these resources for indefinitely, I think our people are going to go against us. That's how I see it.
Thank you very much, Puna, for that. That's really great perspective, and I'm really glad that you've kicked us off and starting the conversation, especially as it relates to a wide island consultation process. So you've got the views from many of the people from across the Cook Islands, which is really wonderful to share that. I'm now going to take us to our next presenter. Now, she has just sent in a presentation remotely because she's been unable to be here. She's got exams, but I would like to. Our next speaker is Margareta. She's the wife of Tauranga Rokasau from the Paramount Chief of Totoya in the Lao group, Fiji. She's assisted her husband in doing research for the social cultural mapping work in the Lao and Lao Seascape Initiative. And she actually holds a degree in computer science and information systems. So she comes from that background, but doing cultural mapping, which is really a different viewpoint to be coming into with. So I'm now going to share her presentation and get the perspectives from Lao. I'm unsure if that's coming through.
I can't hear anything. Chanel, is it supposed to come on audio?
Yeah, I'm just trying to share the new screen now. Just let me see if this comes through, and it comes through. So hopefully that all goes through.
To all our esteemed speakers and our online audience tuning in to this session on institutionalizing Indigenous knowledge and values. It's an honor for me to make contributions to this 10th Pacific Islands Conference on Nature, Conservation and Protected Areas. Today, I will be speaking on the cultural mapping for ocean and island management in the Lao Seascape. Lao Seascape encompasses 60 islands and inlets, half of which is inhabited. and scattered across 336,000 square kilometers of ocean. To guide conservation efforts in our province, our traditional leaders, established the Lao Seascape Initiative. This is in partnership with Conservation International. Lao Seascape Initiative is a community-based initiative that integrates traditional leadership and governance with Western ideals approach to conservation. Lao Seascape Initiative has moved on and has also been established as a strategy and a strategic document on Lao Seascape strategy launched in 2019. The social structure of the Bono Lao communities are tribal communities with communal ownership of land and marine resources. The ownership of their resources, both on land and marine, are aligned to the traditional roles that they assigned within their tribal communities, can be in clans or within their family units. And with these assigned roles are customs and traditions that they practice to fulfill their roles within the community. Our cultural mapping work has been based on the Lao Seascape strategy to achieve sustainable regenerative resources. The vision of the Lao Seascape Initiative by traditional leaders is the Vanua of Lao to be prosperous and grounded in values of respect and collaborative participation to achieve sustainable regenerative resources by 2030 for current and future generations, and to overcome challenges with the guidance of Almighty God. So for the objective of our cultural mapping, in line with their visions, we collected information that had a positive impact on their biodiversity. And also we tried to establish the relationship between their traditions and their resources of terrestrial and marine. So some of the traditions identified, like the Sebu or the offering, the Tambo, Lolo, which is their storehouses, Sole vacuum, which is their communal work, and also some of their traditional fishing practices. They foster a spirit of unity, respect, and compassion. Like for Sebu or the offering, there also were indications of it being an indicator, for the harvest that they brought in. It was an indication to the chief of their leadership or to the harvester of his performance within the community. So there also would be a time for reconciliation if they were not happy with what they had produced. So it also was a learning by doing system, most of all is that we practiced. So in conclusion, we concluded that for these practices, they were all inclusive with through this Vanua governance system, even though they were not organized, because there were also correlation of the erosion of their traditional practices and the degradation of their resources, both marine and for the land. And also their vacant traditional positions or vacant traditional roles had some contributions as well to the erosion of their traditions. And also the traditions that were not in practice were soon going to become extinct. So one of the key recommendations that we had given was the strengthening of the traditional governance system, and also to create a space for traditional leaders to effectively contribute to conservation. we need to understand that these traditional leaders are key in maintaining the governance of these traditional communities. And that is all that I think I can contribute for now. And I'll be happy to answer any queries and any questions later, as Chanel will send this later to me.
Very good.
Manaka Makareta, that was really great. And if there are any questions specific for her, she's invited the audience and participants to reach out. I think the key takeaways from there was the cultural practices in Fiji, such as the tambo, the sevu, force the spirit of unity and respect and this connection. And for them, the practices were very much all inclusive. And that what I found interesting was that there was a strong correlation between the erosion of cultural practices and the degradation of natural resources. And I think that's a really powerful note to be taken away from there, and how some of the vacant traditional roles had also had a correlation with the contributions to erosion and of the traditions, but leading to resource degradation. That is really wonderful with our speakers, what they're sharing at the moment. As we move on, I'm getting conscious of time. I'm going to see if our lovely Josine from the New Caledonia, Daobik, is online to help us with her perspectives from New Caledonia. She is going to be talking about fostering Indigenous practices and conservation within New Caledonia's Province North. Let's see if she is available and online, and I will pass it to her. Okay, seems that we don't have her here. We've had really faulty towers of experiences this morning with getting our speakers and getting the presentation so that we can do remotely. Everyone is in all different corners of the Pacific, and as everyone that works in the Pacific realizes and knows well, that connectivity and matching with technology sometimes doesn't go to plan. So hopefully we might get her later on. But having said that, we will move on with our schedule. And our next speaker will be coming from New York, but he is actually from the Federated States of Micronesia. This is Clement Yao Mulalap, and he's the legal advisor to the permanent mission of FSM in New York at the moment. I am going to now share his presentation on traditional knowledge and the BBNJ instrument, and how we're doing integration of traditional knowledge into the high seas and the overarching large scale of unity that the Pacific is coming together with. Just bear with me a second while I try and get this sorted.
Greetings. My name is Clement Yao Mulalap. I am the legal advisor for the permanent mission of the Federated States of Micronesia to the United Nations in New York City. I apologize that I'm unable to join you live today, albeit virtually, but I'm very happy that I've been allowed to pre-record my presentation for playback during your session today. I've been asked to present on an ongoing negotiation for a so-called BBNJ instrument that I've been working on for the last decade or so, and particularly how to reflect the traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples and local communities in the BBNJ instrument. The BBNJ instrument, as defined here in the slide, is an international legally binding instrument under the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. It is a significant mouthful, but this is actually the formal technical name for the BBNJ instrument at the moment. The focus of the BBNJ instrument is on what are called areas beyond national jurisdiction. And without getting too far into the weeds of the Law of the Sea Convention, an area beyond national jurisdiction is a high seas area, which is basically the high seas water column, beyond the exclusive economic zone, as well as the deep seabed, ocean floor, and subsoil thereof underneath the high seas area. This is the current definition of an area beyond national jurisdiction in the negotiations. And as you can probably tell, an area beyond national jurisdiction is typically quite a bit of a distance away from the coastlines. And as you can see here, again, in the graphic on the right-hand side of the screen, the darker shading of blue represents the high seas and, for the most part, the areas beyond national jurisdiction, which cover a large majority, a significant majority of the world's ocean, compared to exclusive economic zones, which are the lighter shaded blue areas. The BBNJ instrument has four main elements that are taken together as a package. They include marine genetic resources, environmental impact assessments, capacity building and transfer of marine technology, and most pertinently, I think, for our discussion today, area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. In the negotiations, the Pacific SIDS, the Pacific Small Island Developing States, have been negotiating as a unified bloc, which makes sense because, as you can see in the graphic there, our exclusive economic zones cover a vast part of the ocean, and they're adjacent to and surround large pockets of high seas areas, large pockets of areas beyond national jurisdiction. And so for that reason, we've taken a particular interest, active interest in the negotiations. Now, in the negotiations, the Pacific states have been arguing that the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and local communities must be reflected as a source of knowledge for the management and other measures under the BBNJ instrument. And to help address some of the questions that have arisen in the negotiations, we've tried to define who indigenous peoples are and who local communities are, at least under current international law, as you can see from the screen there. However, current international law does not have a uniform single definition for a universally accepted definition for either concept, but we've tried to draw from different instruments and processes to put together working definitions of the sort. The same goes for traditional knowledge. And again, for traditional knowledge, citing from a whole large number of international instruments and processes, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, our working definition of traditional knowledge is that it's a living body of knowledge and skills and so forth, including intangible heritage that's been passed down through generations in a continuous manner, as well as in a locally meaningful context by indigenous peoples and local communities. They are developers, preservers, guardians, and custodians of such knowledge, as well as its creators. And this can be agricultural, aquacultural, it can be environmental, including in terms of conservation measures. It can be knowledge associated with genetic resources. And we view this traditional knowledge as a complement to so-called white coat or Western science. And so in terms of how to integrate specific types of traditional knowledge into the BBNJ instrument, the Pacific states have argued for three types of traditional knowledge that's relevant to the BBNJ instrument. Now we'll go through all three types here in this slide and then go to specific examples in the following slides for each type. The first type is the traditional knowledge on connectivity. The idea that holders of traditional knowledge have traditional knowledge with respect to marine species and other marine life that move and range and migrate between coastal waters and areas beyond national jurisdiction, including species of cultural significance for traditional knowledge holders such as sharks, sea turtles, whales, salmon, and so forth. This would be traditional knowledge about their migratory paths, about their breeding patterns, and about their vulnerabilities to environmental stressors. And this can be particularly useful for establishing area-based management tools such as MPAs that recognize these marine species. The second type of relevant traditional knowledge is environmental best practices. And the idea that traditional knowledge holders have developed over millennia best practices for managing their marine environments and coastal waters, and how these practices can be useful models for similar management practices under the BBNJ instrument in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And we're talking, of course, about seasonal closures, about taboo in different Polynesian and Melanesian countries, the bull in Palau, and different sort of closures and take limits that are practiced in coastal waters. The third type of relevant traditional knowledge is traditional knowledge derived from traditional navigation, which is the practice of open ocean traditional navigation that is still being practiced by quite a few people in the Pacific region. And that depends on an intimate knowledge of marine life and marine spaces and marine processes, including on the high seas, that can be useful for informing management measures under the BBNJ instrument. And so the traditional knowledge that's been gleaned from that navigational practices include knowledge about where fish will aggregate, where fish will spawn, migratory patterns, and even wave patterns that are useful for the navigational activities. As I said, in terms of the connectivity element, the connectivity prong, you see these scientific studies that have been made or that track the movements of a large number of culturally significant marine species for which there is traditional knowledge, including tuna, sharks, and turtles, and so forth. And you can see how they range widely across the ocean, and here is across the Pacific Ocean. So the second type of traditional knowledge, we talked about environmental management best practices, and the idea that traditional knowledge holders view the ocean as one ocean, the ecosystem approach, and for which there are very fine-tuned management measures applied. And we see the ecosystem approach throughout the Pacific, including in Hawaii with the Ahupua'a and the Puawa in Solomon Islands, and different marine management measures such as the Masala in Papua New Guinea, the Tabu in Fiji, the Bull in Palau, that can be very useful sort of models for the BBNJ instrument. And finally, the third element, like we talked about, has to do with traditional navigation, which is still widely practiced. It involves an intimate knowledge of the marine space. And you do see on the upper right-hand side of the image of the slide, the Hokulea out of Hawaii that undertook a worldwide voyage several years ago that stopped in New York City, and that incorporated both traditional knowledge as well as so-called Western science in its voyage around. And to this point, the Pacific States have been quite successful in getting nearly 24 references to traditional knowledge and its holders in the draft BBNJ instrument. We've gotten support from nearly all delegations for referencing traditional knowledge in the BBNJ instrument, including from some major developed countries. And at this point, we are cautiously optimistic that at the end of the day, at the end of the negotiations, the BBNJ instrument will reflect traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and local communities, thanks in no small part to the advocacy of the Pacific SIDS of drawing on our traditional conservation and sustainable use management measures in our waters. For me, and thank you very much for listening, and I'll be very happy to receive and respond to any questions or comments folks might have after the session. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Clem, for that. I know he was a little bit disappointed he couldn't join us live today, but as he said, any sort of questions, please send them on to him. I think he gave a good synopsis of the biodiversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction framework and how they're integrating traditional knowledge and values into that framework. It's a good example of how we are incorporating and institutionalizing the traditional knowledge into international policy, and that will have flow-on effects. Given that we haven't got our other speaker online, and in true talanoa fashion, we have brought on to the speaking platform a few other guests to also share some of their views in the time that we've got, but also ask potential questions of our panelists that we do have here. So I would like to invite Kevin Iro from the Cook Islands also to perhaps give his perspective on what Puna had shared earlier and how he saw it, and maybe ask some questions of the panelists here. I'll just remind Kevin just to try and keep it relatively short given the time period we have, but the floor is over to you, Kevin.
Yes, kia ora everybody. Thank you, Chanel. I will keep it short because I think Puna framed it very well, about the spirit behind Marae Moana. And what drew me to approach the House of Ariki first about the Marae Moana concept is exactly what he said. We'd moved away from our traditional knowledge systems. Not moved away, but they'd been sort of altered in the fact that, as Puna said, Rāui was becoming permanent, and a lot of these, this is particularly in Rarotonga, a lot of these Rāui were being made permanent outside tourism accommodations. And of course, if you make something permanent, then the ecosystems outside of those areas are just getting, obliterated, and that wasn't the spirit of what Rāui is moving these areas. And I thought to myself, well, when you look at how the world is moving in terms of industry and that, why couldn't we apply that same traditional Rāui system that works out into the open ocean? And that's where the Marae Moana came in. We're at early stages now. We have 50 nautical mile buffer zones around each island, and we're working with each island to figure out how they want to manage those areas. But at the same time, and this comes back to your local Rāui, is you really need knowledge before you can, make those Rāui decisions, those conservation decisions. So we're on a sort of journey to gain as much knowledge as possible. And I loved what the last speaker said about, I believe that our ancestors thought of the ocean as one. The ecosystems as one. It's just one large ecosystem that includes terrestrial. And I think that's really what Marae Moana portrays. In an English sense, you'd say it's a whole domain approach to conservation. But really, I think in an indigenous perspective, it's how our ancestors viewed conservation and how we should be looking after our environment. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. That's really great and great to supplement what Puna had shared earlier. Building on that, and the approach that the Cook Islands took which is very similar to some of the approach that the Lao Seascape was undergoing. I would like to also invite Susanna, who is our Pacific lead for Conservation International for our Pacific Islands program. I know that she'll be able to add on from what Margarita had said and also build on what you and Puna have shared in using Lao as an example of really integrating traditional knowledge and values into governance into the definition of what conservation means in these areas. So Susanna, over to you, my dear.
Hey, thank you. Bula vinaka, everyone. Welcome to this session again. My name is Susanna. Traditionally, my fish is the Matamata fish. It's found on the inshore areas of my village. I am from the village of Ketera, Moala, Lau. And I have a fascination with manta rays. My tree is the iwi. And I know that, many of us from the Pacific Island, we have totems that connect us and identify us to nature around us. And as we all know, many of our cultures across the Pacific are interwoven with the nature around us, and it supports us for food security, helps us become resilient to climate change, and of course, support the livelihood of our people. As we've heard from many of the cultures across the Pacific, we have very, very close connections with nature. In Fiji, for instance, our society, culture traditionally is, broken up into clans. and each clan has a function, each clan has a role to play for the benefit of the whole community. We have the chiefs, and of course these clans are inherited. They are not passed by selection. The chiefs, of course, take leadership role. We have the priesthood, the warriors, the fishermen, the carvers, the builders, and of course the artists. We need our artists to be around to help us relax and enjoy ourselves, and of course commemorate many of the historical moments that we go through. And with the grace of God, in fact, many of our clans have the wisdom. They have been blessed with wisdom that is God-given, that gives them the skill sets necessary to undertake all the necessary procedures and processes for them to successfully fulfill their role in the society and in the community. In Fiji, for instance, when the fisherman clan, for instance, is subdivided into two sub-clans. We have the people or sub-clan that actually go out and fish, and we have the sub-clan that goes out to do seafaring, the Ndoni Soko. And so even in that context, they have their own roles and responsibilities, and everything evolves in and around the benefit and the betterment of the community in the long term. As we've heard, there has, however, been a lot of degradation across time and across our societies. Traditional cultures and values have degraded, and resulting, of course, in the loss of knowledge that we now know. And many of the unique relationships that our people had with nature are also, of course, lost. And we don't know anymore how the procedures, processes for the traditional protocols needed to be undertaken in order for certain tasks to be successfully implemented, in the traditional culture. That in itself is perhaps the biggest disjunct between nature and our societies as we grow and become too westernized in our opinions and in the way that we do things. Perhaps there is a need to really bring back the cultural stewardship element of our society so that we can be better stewards of the natural resources around us. Perhaps working with government and local communities together, setting up co-management of terrestrial and marine protected areas, perhaps would be some of the more effective ways of tackling habitat degradation and habitat loss, species loss that we are now facing in the Pacific region. The nexus between traditional and political leadership, as we know, continues to be a power struggle in many of our societies. While we continue to find pathways that bring peace and prosperity to our people, I believe it's important to always also remind ourselves of the roles of government and community leadership play in balancing a win-win situation for all, for prosperity. Governments, of course, are selected by the people, the very people that have traditional heritage. And governments, of course, are guided by constitutions, policies, laws, and regulations for the benefit and the greater good of all citizens. While community and traditional leadership, as we've heard in our context, have traditional stewardships that have helped our people manage, sustain themselves, and become resilient over time to the present and current generation. Perhaps it's time for us to look for that nexus, the best mix, the best fit that will ensure that communities are becoming better stewards of the resources around them, while the government, with the legislations, with the good policies, with good governance systems, could play a role in improving economic viability for our countries. It's good to hear from Clement that there is a lot of work happening at the very high level for BBNJ, and that there is recognition at that high level policy of the connectivity of the best practices that's happening across the region, and the way that we, the people of the Pacific, have navigated and have evolved over time to be the people that we are now. Perhaps there is a need for us to seriously think about current policies that are in place. Perhaps there is a need for us to relook at the laws and ensure that the policies and the laws would be there to support not only be us, indigenous people becoming better stewards of the natural resources around us, but also all communities in our country become better understand the roles of traditional societies could play in improving that stewardship role. And so perhaps, bringing all this to summary, we strongly believe that there is a role for traditional management in the protection of both terrestrial and biodiversity, protect terrestrial and marine biodiversity in our spaces and in our countries. And we certainly hope that as we continue, moving forward, looking at the best fit, the best way to move forward, we will bring prosperity to our current and future generation in the Pacific Island countries.
That's great. I'm going to. Oh, sorry, Puna. I'm passing it to you. I see that you've got something to say on this. I'm hoping that the others can hear you through my audio. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chanel. I just want to endorse the opening remarks by Susanna. She said that our people in the Pacific are very close with nature, and I think that reflects right across the Pacific. And I think if we are to look for a definition for the term conservation, it's time that we have a relook at our relationship with nature, because we ourselves are the biggest culprit in the problems that we are causing to the environment around us. I just want to add that remark.
Thank you, Puna. No, and I think many of us listening on these conversations would agree with you wholeheartedly. I do have a question though for you, Puna, while we've got you on the line there. What do you see, given your experience in the Cook Islands and doing this amazing amount of consultation across all the atolls with Cook Islanders? What do you see as identifying the pathways for actual strengthening or institutionalizing traditional knowledge, traditional values into actual conservation planning?
It's a big challenge, Chanel. The mentality of our people today is mixed up, meaning there are those who are very, very strong in our traditions. There are those who are exposed to Westernizations, to Western values, and it is our job. It is our job to see how we can mix. Where do we find the mix? What kind of mix are we looking for to find a pathway forward for our people, where we can sustain our economy, our environment, our resources? Very challenging. For example, we have established a couple of rawi on this island where I am right now, and only to find that the worst culprits are locals. They are the ones poaching these rawi that we have established. But look, it is not an excuse for us to do nothing. For the leaders of our communities, for the leaders of our nation, it is for me, it's more reason why we should be a lot more active in convincing our people that there are measures that we can put in place. We have traditional knowledge, we have scientific knowledge. Where can we find the middle ground to find a pathway forward for future sustainability? That's the brief explanation I can give you.
No, thank you very much, Puna. That's really great to also have that sort of perspective. I do note that we're coming close to our time, and so in the interests of keeping to the best of available time, I will probably have to wrap us up here, but I do encourage the ongoing dialogue and conversations that this has sparked. I think you touched on a really important point about, some of our people with the poaching and stuff, which actually comes back to this importance of traditional governance, traditional values, traditional leaders, and having that governance system. And as Margarita had pointed out with some of her research, the correlation between the erosion of that and then some of the erosion of the environment and natural resources. So I think that that points well to that. I think in summing up our whole session today, going from the biodiversity areas beyond national jurisdiction and policies, and integrating policies for traditional knowledge and values to the international scale, and then using Lao, the seascape, and the Cook Islands as an example of approaches of how we are integrating conservation and at national levels. I think we've come a long way in this discussion and getting a diversity of views and what the definition of conservation actually means to the many people across the Pacific, in that it's not about protecting and making pristine areas, it's about integration and making sure that we've really got, we're connected with nature, but we really have nature and culture being managed at the same time, because one is not more important than the other. It is like two wings of a bird. The bird cannot fly if one of those wings is crippled. So this is something that is really poignant right now. I know we've been talking about it for quite some time, and it's just gaining more and more momentum and becoming more and more important in conservation planning, and becoming part of the actual metrics and measuring systems that such conservation projects will take on, and as well as integration into actual policy and strategies of national governments. With that, I think that I would like to thank our participants. I would also like to thank the back of house administration and IT and translators that we've had involved with this session, but throughout the conference. I think they're the unsung heroes of this. And I would also like to just give a little plug for the Sute Scholarship Fund, which I think many of you know. Sute, she was a very strong, fierce warrior for a lot of what we've discussed here. And she's played a major role over the last 25 years within conservation programming and integrating traditional knowledge at such a scale. And she passed away earlier this year, but she's left such a legacy. And we've created the scholarship fund to really help build capacity of Pacific female conservation warriors that are coming in, and very much associated with some of the stuff we've been talking about here. So if you want more information on that, please visit the Conservation International booth online, or email me directly, or others here. But with that, thank you very much. Whaftaitele lava, and I hand it over back to you, Awuta and Andy.